Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR adventure into the world of one of my favourite artists and poets, William Blake. Blake worked with both the pen and the brush, and his creative output was often visionary and strange in its content, as well as being sometimes quite elusive in its meaning. He wasn't really understood very much at all in his own lifetime, in the 18th and early 19th centuries. His work baffled a lot of his contemporaries, and he was considered by many people to be somewhat mad. However, my view is that Blake was simply ahead of his time. His work has always spoken, I think, to readers and viewers who enjoy mythic or metaphysical themes, and he both writes and paints with a great deal of vibrancy, spirituality, and individuality that personally really appeals to me. So, in this talk, we're going to look at Blake's work as both an artist and a poet. We'll discover a little bit about his life, examine his extraordinary creativity, and I'll also include the details for a rather marvellous exhibition of Blake's work that's currently running in London at Tate Britain, and which you can perhaps go and see for yourself if you happen to be in that part of the world. As usual, there'll be a slideshow of images to accompany our talk, and nearly all of these photographs were taken by me at the Tate exhibition, which I was lucky enough to visit quite recently. So they will give you a taste of what's on display there if you can't make it to London yourself. However, there's no need to look at any of the images on the slideshow right now if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the luminous and fantastical world of William Blake. Blake was born in 1757 in Soho, which today is part of the West End entertainment district of central London. But in the 18th century it was a fairly sedate residential area. Blake's parents ran a thriving hosiery and haberdashery shop, in fact, and the family lived over the shop premises in a large and fairly elegant-looking Georgian building on Broad Street, which today is called Broadwick Street. The young William was one of 7 Blake children, although only 4 of his brothers and sisters survived infancy, and it seems that from a very early age he was something of an original. At the age of 8 years old, he was walking through Peckham Rye one day, Peckham Rye being a park in southeast London, when he saw what he described as a tree filled with angels, bright angelic wings bespangling every bough like stars. This would be the first of many celestial visions that Blake would claim to witness over the course of his lifetime, and it led to him developing an intense and rather unique spirituality. At the same time, his enthusiasm and commitment to becoming an artist was also developing early, and his parents were so willing to encourage him in this that when he was 10 years old, they actually removed him from school and sent him instead for drawing lessons at Henry Parr's drawing school on the Strand. This might seem like quite a startling parental decision today, but within the context of the 1760s it actually made quite a lot of sense. It wasn't unusual for children to stop attending school once they had learned to read and write, and also back then becoming an artist wasn't such a precarious career choice as it is today, because in the 18th century, the drawn image was still the primary source of visual information. Photography was still a long way from being invented, and illustrators were in demand to create the visuals for books, newspapers, and decorations of all forms, really. Pictures were largely reproduced at this time via the technique of engraving, and this is a method whereby a picture or design was cut into a hard plate, usually made of metal, then covered with ink. When the ink is wiped away, some of it remains in the grooves that have been cut into the surface of the plate, and this can then be placed in a printing press and used to transfer the image onto a sheet of paper. So engraving was very much a part of the 18th century publishing industry, and the ability to engrave pictures well was a highly specialised skill that required a great deal of both artistic and technical talent. Good engravers were always usually able to find work, and so really encouraging the young William Blake to pursue his talents for drawing was a fairly shrewd move on the part of his parents. After 4 years at Henry Parr's drawing school, he was then apprenticed to the established engraver James Bezier, and Blake spent 7 years with him, learning the techniques of engraving at his studio on Great Queen Street in Covent Garden. Once he'd served his apprenticeship, William then enrolled at the Royal Academy of Arts, where he further honed his artist's eye and improved his drawing and painting skills. The Academy was very good for him because it encouraged him to think of himself as an artist, and he was also surrounded by other artists while he was there, so he was really immersed in that world and living and breathing artistic endeavour. However, the very formal style of the Royal Academy was something that Blake rebelled against. He didn't really like sitting there copying old masters day after day, which is sort of how the techniques were taught back then. But I think that discipline of study did actually contribute to his work in the long term, because his drawings of the human body have a really muscular quality, along with a certain fluidity and grace that I think he probably gained through his studies at the Academy. As an Academy member, he was also entitled to exhibit his work there, which of course was very important for young artists as a means of gaining exposure. So he began his artistic career with a fairly fair prospect, and he was soon finding plenty of work as an engraver. In 1782, at the age of 25, he married Catherine Boucher, the daughter of a market gardener who was just 19 years old, and who could neither read nor write. However, after their marriage, Blake taught her how to do both, and he also taught her how to draw, engrave, and print, so that she could assist him with his work. Over the next 45 years of their marriage, she did just that, and she proved to be an incredibly helpful and inspirational assistant to William Blake. Biographers have sometimes portrayed her as a sort of traditional, patient, stable wife, the conventional supporter of a brilliant but temperamental artistic mind. But the facts don't really support this interpretation of Catherine. In truth, it seems that she was as passionate as William himself. She declared that the first moment she saw him, she knew him immediately, and knew that she would be spending the rest of her life with him. And she was also described by one of the couple's friends as being the madder of the two, which suggests that there was rather more to her than the placid helpmeet that she's sometimes portrayed as. Blake's jobbing life as an engraver meant that he had to devote his evenings to the creation of his own artistic work, and his plans for that work were very detailed and highly ambitious. He was influenced by the illuminated manuscripts that were produced by monks in the medieval era, and which are highly coloured and have a beautiful luminosity to them. Blake wanted to create his own versions of these illuminated books in order to disseminate his political, spiritual and artistic ideas. And so he began with a manuscript called Poetical Sketches that he printed a small number of copies of in 1783. It wasn't a particularly successful endeavour, but it gave him the impetus to keep going and create further books of designs, as he called them. He was assisted in this by a technical breakthrough that he also made within the production of his engravings. He invented a process known as relief etching, and that allowed him to combine text and images all on one metal plate, which actually hadn't been possible with conventional engraving processes up until that point. The innovation made the printing of his illuminated books far easier and far cheaper. And so over the next few years he published a series of his own works, including Tyrael, the Book of Thel, the Book of Urizen, the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, America a Prophecy, and Europe a Prophecy. This latter work is particularly interesting because it's known that the frontispiece to the book was definitely coloured not by William himself but by Catherine Blake. It shows a striking illustration of a giant twisting snake, which has been tinted in multicoloured shades of emerald green, ultramarine blue, yellow, violet and ochre. And the fact that William was confident enough in Catherine's skills as a colourist is a mark, I think, of how important she was to his artistic process. He referred to her as his dark shadow of delight. And an early biographer of Blake, Alexander Gilchrist, said, "The poet and his wife did everything in making the book. Writing, designing, printing, engraving, everything except manufacturing the paper. The very ink, or colour rather, they did make." That quote tells you everything, I think, about how vital Catherine was to the production of Blake's little books of designs. Blake himself was certainly all in favour of women expressing themselves, creatively, politically, and sexually too. In 1793, he published a narrative epic poem called Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which has as its central figure a heroine, Othune, who is on a quest to overthrow the restrictions that have been placed on her as a woman by conventional religion and conventional society. And Blake was not alone in his advocacy of women's rights during this time. The late 18th century was a relatively forward-thinking era for women. Although I say relative because, of course, at this time, legally women were still the property of their husbands. However, there was a radical intellectual discourse that had begun to develop around the issue of a woman's autonomy, and in the year preceding Visions of the Daughters of Albion, Mary Wollstonecraft had published her great work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her publisher was Joseph Johnson, and he also employed William Blake as an engraver. He'd actually already commissioned him to illustrate an earlier work of Wollstonecraft's called Original Stories from Real Life. And although it's not known if Blake and Wollstonecraft ever actually met, they certainly had friends in common, and they definitely shared many common principles and ideas. Both were committed to the concept of free love, which today is a term that tends to be associated with 1960s hippies. But in the 18th century, it was indicative of a more politically radical position that advocated for the rights of women, but also advocated for the rights of many other marginalised groups as well. Anyone, really, whose health and rights were jeopardised by the established laws of society at the time. And that was basically everybody, other than the straight, white, wealthy aristocratic men who governed England in the 18th century. So Blake's work was intensely political. As well as advocating for sexual equality, he was also a fierce opponent of slavery, imperialism, and organised religion. And these were very radical views at the time that theoretically could have got him locked up in prison. I think had his work been more widely distributed, perhaps it would have been suppressed or censored. But Blake was protected from punishment, really, by his own obscurity. His books didn't sell very many copies, and even though they contained strong political messages, they were couched in very symbolic terms. Blake used language and images that were somewhat mystical in their meaning, and so consequently they were open to many different interpretations. This, I think, saved him from being considered an anti-establishment figure, but it also meant that his work never really reached a mass audience or enjoyed any popular appeal. It was simply too obscure. His poems were bewildering to most readers, and people found his art unsettling with its vivid colours, bold compositions, and intense and often unflinching depictions of human anguish and sorrow. Nevertheless, in spite of a lack of worldly success, Blake pressed on with his work and his vision, and in 1794 he published what would ultimately become his most popular illuminated book, Songs of Innocence and Experience. He'd originally published Songs of Innocence in 1789, but then 5 years later he republished it with a companion volume about experience. And within these two contrasting volumes, he attempts to set out what he sees as the two contrary states of the human soul. He relates innocence and experience to the states of being in paradise and being in the fallen world, as Adam and Eve are described as being in the Genesis book of the Bible. Blake drew inspiration from John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, which tells that story of the fall from Eden in narrative verse. And Blake was much given to writing narrative poems himself, but he chose not to do so for Songs of Innocence and Experience. Instead of writing one long story in verse, he created a series of short poems that have very strong rhymes and strong meters, and which set out the two conditions of innocence and experience through a series of different themes and different subject matters. On the surface, the book appears to have a fairly conventional and simplistic message. Innocence is celebrated and experience is denigrated, or rather seen as a process that taints innocence and leads to sin and suffering. However, Blake wasn't a simplistic or conventional artist, and he didn't really believe in such basic polarities. To him, innocence and experience, joy and suffering, were all part of one human condition, that you couldn't really have the one without the other, and that both held a seed of divinity within them. Consequently, if you make a closer reading of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, you soon notice that many of the innocence verses contain quite dark shadow within them, and many of the experience songs also incorporate aspects of joy and elation. A good example of this is a poem called The Tiger, which today is probably one of the most famous of Blake's songs of innocence and experience, and which appears on the surface to be a meditation on the horrors of violence and destruction. Within the verse, the figure of the poet seems to be dreading the ferocity and deadly terrors of the tiger, and he marvels at the fact that the creator of the innocent lamb, which is a reference to another of Blake's poems from the Innocence cycle, could also create such a fearsome, fiery beast. However, the poet's apparent dread of this terrible creature is actually undercut by the driving rhythm of the verse, which is iambic, so it follows a compelling pattern of da-dum, 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 da-dum. And also the bright, vivid imagery within the poem that just lifts the whole piece into something close to exhilaration. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand, and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? The poet never attempts to answer his own questions. He leaves the reader to ponder them. However, that amazing driving rhythm within the verse, as well as the vibrant colours in the illustration that accompanies the poem, is perhaps a clue to Blake's real meaning. There's beauty in both innocence and experience, and both of these supposedly contrary states of the soul need to be balanced and acknowledged if humans are to flourish. Songs of Innocence and Experience sold about 30 copies during Blake's own lifetime, which isn't a lot, but nevertheless it was his most successful illuminated book, and it's a work that has endured and grown in popularity over the centuries since his death. Although in general Blake's work wasn't appreciated by those around him, he was admired as an uncompromising genius by a few discerning followers who encouraged him with his work. Amongst these followers were several important patrons who actually supported Blake by commissioning him to create works for them, and thereby providing him with an artistic income so that he didn't need to rely so heavily on his engraving commissions. One particularly significant benefactor was William Haley, who was a poet, but was also lucky enough to have inherited an independent fortune and a private estate. In 1800, Haley invited William and Catherine Blake to move to the village of Felpham, where he owned a cottage, and this was the only time in their lives when the Blakes would live outside London. William found himself inspired by his rural surroundings. No other house can please me so well, nor shall I ever be persuaded, I believe, that it can ever be improved in beauty or use. These were his thoughts on the cottage that he lived in, and of Felpham itself he wrote, "The villagers here are not mere rustics, they are polite and modest. Meat is cheaper than in London, but the sweet air and the voices of winds, trees and birds, and the odours of the happy ground make it a dwelling for immortals. Work will go on here with Godspeed. Work did indeed go on in the cottage, and it was here that Blake began to write his epic poem, Milton. The poem itself isn't very well known today, but the preface to the poem is perhaps Blake's most famous work. This is 4 stanzas of verse that meditate on the idea of creating a utopia, or what Blake refers to as a second Jerusalem. In 1916, these stanzas would be turned into a song called Jerusalem by the composer Sir Hubert Parry, and in the centuries since Parry wrote Jerusalem, it's become one of the most famous hymns in the English-language Christian tradition. However, Blake didn't intend it to be a hymn, and I don't think many of the thousands of people who sing Jerusalem today realise that the words were written by a radical visionary who despised organised religion. He in fact saw his poem as a call to arms against what he believed to be the repressive ideologies of church and state. But whether you subscribe to a particular religious doctrine or not, I do think that the words of Blake's poem Jerusalem are very inspirational in the way that they encourage humans to strive for a better world. William and Catherine stayed in Felpham until 1803, when, rather unfortunately, William became involved in an altercation with a soldier in the local pub, the Fox Inn, and parted ways with William Haley shortly after. He then returned to London, where fortunately he had other patrons who were equally important to his artistic development. One of these was the Reverend Joseph Thomas, who was a clergyman, and who commissioned Blake to create a series of illustrations for Milton's Paradise Lost, which, as we've already heard, was a highly influential work for Blake. So he enjoyed creating this commission very much, and he produced 12 designs in ink and watercolour, which vividly bring to life Milton's epic interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, and which also do full justice to the poem's character of Satan, because if you've read the poem you'll know that although technically Adam and Eve are meant to be the protagonists, it's Satan, with his power and his intellect and his doubt, who is the real anti-hero of the work. Another extremely important patron of Blake's was a civil servant called Thomas Butts. Remarkably, Butts purchased up to 200 of Blake's works, including a series of watercolours illustrating the Book of Revelation, which are known today as the Great Red Dragon paintings, and which are some of the most startling and compelling paintings ever produced by Blake. Butts also purchased a series of Blake's large monotype prints, which he'd coloured by hand to give the works a brilliant textured surface, and these prints have a series of different subject matters, all of which are quite intriguing. Two of my favourites from this series are Newton and The Night of Enitharmon's Joy. In the latter print, we see a depiction of the goddess Enitharmon, who is a figure from Blake's personal system of mythology, and who is said to have been partly inspired by his wife, Catherine, and also partly by the Greek figure of Hecate. Enitharmon is sitting cross-legged on the ground, and she has 2 human figures behind her who have their faces turned away, and who might perhaps unite with Enitharmon to represent the tradition of a goddess in her triple aspect. She's also surrounded by an assortment of rather wonderful creatures. There's an ass on one side of the composition, munching on a thistle. There's an owl, a snake, and also a rather splendid bat flying in the night sky. In spite of the dark colours used in the print, it's still incredibly rich and vivid, and it certainly appeals to my Gothic sensibilities. Newton, by contrast, has a very different subject matter. It's a somewhat iconoclastic portrait of the great physicist Sir Isaac Newton, although it bears very little relation to how Newton actually looked in real life. It depicts him instead in what I suppose is a symbolic state, as a young, virile, muscular, and almost godlike young man who sits naked on a rock at the bottom of the sea. His concentration is fully engaged by the diagram he is bent over, while behind him, the rock he's sitting on is covered with brightly coloured sea anemones who gently wave around their tentacles in the background. Blake was deeply mistrustful of the Enlightenment and of the scientific advances that were being made in the 18th century. And because of this, scholars of his work have interpreted the Newton print as a criticism of the scientist. However, I'm not entirely sure I agree with this established view of the work, because it depicts Newton in such an idealised and playful form. One of the joys of Blake's work, in fact, is that you can't pin it down or ascribe to it one particular meaning or dogma. It eludes certainty and is all about subtlety and individual interpretation. Supported by his friends and patrons, Blake was able to continue making a living as an artist and an engraver. Later in life, he did become frustrated that his work hadn't reached a wider audience or received the recognition that he felt it deserved. However, he did inspire a new, younger generation of artists who called themselves the Ancients, perhaps after Blake's work The Ancient of Days, and who included the painters Samuel Palmer and John Linnell. Linnell, in fact, commissioned Blake to produce what would become his last major cycle of work, illustrations for Dante's epic poem, The Divine Comedy. This took more than 3 years to produce, and sadly it remained unfinished because Blake died while he was still working on it at the age of 69. Nevertheless, he still managed to produce 102 illustrations, ranging from pencil and watercolour sketches to elaborate coloured engravings. And as with all of his work, his compositions for the Divine Comedy are frequently startling and surprising. I particularly love Blake's interpretation of Beatrice addressing Dante, which features vivid shades of blue, vermilion and yellow in a design that whirls with colour and energy. He also created a very compelling illustration for his depiction of Dante and Virgil approaching the angel who guards the entrance to purgatory. This is again a deeply coloured work, and it features a quite extraordinary red cloud that is obscuring the sun in a pink and blue sky, and which appears almost abstract and highly stylised in its design. With its dynamic rays of sunshine radiating out, the composition looks surprisingly modern. It reminds me more of an Art Deco design from the 1920s than a watercolour from the 1820s. But Blake's vivid intensity in both prose and paint is one of the reasons why I personally love his work so much. It doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always meet your expectations or please your eye. But it does always make you pause, make you think. And, in my own case at least, it always raises my creative energy. William Blake was a mass of contradictions. He was intensely spiritual, yet shunned organised religion. He longed for fame, yet refused to compromise his vision in any way that would have made his work more popular. And he thought in grand, epic terms, yet some of his most arresting work is exquisitely miniature, and glows like a set of tiny jewels. I think it's probably from all these apparent contradictions that his immense energy as an artist originated, and which he expressed in his flowing lines, his bold use of colour, the insistent rhythms of his poems, and in his sometimes obscure, yet always visionary subject matter. Blake is an artist who doesn't necessarily need to be fully understood. He merely needs to be connected with, and those of us who do connect with his work are granted the privilege of access to that same amazing energy and heart-soaring inspiration that galvanized Blake himself. As I record this talk in 2019, there's currently an opportunity to witness all of that energy and inspiration in an exhibition of Blake's work that's currently running at the Tate Britain Gallery in London. As I said earlier, I've been lucky enough to visit this exhibition already, and I must say it's quite astonishing. There's a huge amount of his work on display, rooms and rooms of his prints, engravings and watercolours, and while I suppose that might make it a little bit overwhelming to newcomers, if you're a committed fan of Blake's work, it's an absolute treat. The exhibition runs until February 2020, so you have another 3 months to try and get to see it if you can. But if you can't get to London, then you can also find a selection of Blake's work in the online catalogue for the Tate's permanent collection. I'll put a link to both the exhibition and the online catalogue in the description below the video. So this brings our talk about William Blake to a close, and I do hope you've enjoyed exploring the work of this visionary poet and artist. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. And until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.